So tonight at the Active Travel Cafe, we're going to start with our usual crowdsourced news update. And so you get thinking, please, about things that you'd like to share, anything that's happening where you live or kind of in the country or even globally that you think we should be talking about or people would like to hear, or even if you have questions. There's often so many expert people here. If there's something that you're struggling with in your local area and you want to ask if anybody can share sort of advice or pointers, then that's very welcome. And then we have one speaker tonight, and that's Dr. Neil Carter from De Montfort University. He is the author of Cycling in the British, A Modern History, and he's going to share some of his work with us. But having read his book, it is a really fantastic book, and I'm sure I'm very excited about hearing him speak, and I'm sure many of you will, or all of you will really enjoy his talk. So before we get started on that, I can see two hands up already, very keen. H, do you want to start?
Yeah, briefly. But one thing I want to catch up with, how's the thing with the health and safety prosecution under Section 3 concerning the fatalities on the busway? Because there was a cyclist killed and various other things. The busway separation between a 56-mile-an-hour bus and the sort of 4-mile-an-hour pedestrian was pretty much inadequate. And I think there's been various moves on that, but I don't know how far that's got. And the other question I'm going to ask about is anybody been to or going to some of the DFT active travel sessions? I was vaguely planning Milton Keynes, but because I can do that on the bus, on the coach down to Coachways and sort of get there at 4 o'clock in the morning and then cycle over. But I don't know what other ones are like, and has anybody sampled one?
I can't answer either of those questions.
Tim,
I could see sticking his thumb up though. You've been to Leicester's today, haven't you? You're on mute though.
Yes, of course. I have been to Leicester today. I can recommend it. Steve is a very good host. The DFT are in listening mode. There were a range of different transports, planners, housing, councils, campaigners, a real mix. Not enough people in the room, a vast number of suits, but it's well facilitated and it's a good talking event. It's mainly sitting around tables discussing a series of topics. I'll put the link for the other venues in the chat. It's definitely worth doing.
Thanks, Tim. And if anybody can answer H's question, either put your hand up or stick it in the chat about the buses. Thanks, H. Ben.
Yeah, I heard similar report about the DFT sessions from a colleague. Haven't been to one yet, but will be at Euston. What I was going to mention was the New Towns Task Force have released their initial report. And it's notable to me how little mention there is of active travel in it. There's a mention of the buildings being higher density, which is then being sold as making it easier to walk around. And there's talk of being well connected, having effective public transport within the town itself, as well as links to wider transport networks and support cycling and walking, but there's no clarity about whether the cycling and walking supported is as a means of transport or just as a leisure activity. And so, to me, the few words there weren't exactly reassuring.
That's really interesting to hear. Yeah, and perhaps we can. I think we're hoping to have somebody from Active Travel England again in the coming months, very soon, and perhaps that's something that we could put to them. But if anybody else asks questions about this and wants to report back, it would be really good to hear more about that. Catherine.
Hi, yeah, so actually a little bit of personal news from me, which is a bit cheeky. I've just been appointed chair of the Cycle Forum in Dundee, and I have to say I wouldn't have accepted the nomination if it hadn't been for coming to these calls every week. You're all really inspiring, so thank you for that, I think. Following on from that, I had an email from the local councillor who deals with active travel, among many other things, inviting me for a chat, which we met up last week for a coffee, chatted for a full hour. And I heard the words, "You're pushing against an open door." So no concrete news just yet, but it feels like things are maybe moving forward a little bit in Dundee, where in the past we've sort of looked at Glasgow and Edinburgh and thought, why can't we have that? So, and I did get one bit of news that I can't share till April, but I will share that with you once I can.
Leave us hanging.
Yeah,
That's really exciting. Congratulations on your
no, thank you.
yeah, we'll look forward to hearing more when, if you want to come
Yeah,
back more about Dundee when you kind of, got to grips with it all. That would be great.
yeah, thank you.
Good luck. Robin.
Yes, thank you. Some local news and some national news from me. So we had our county council budget set last week, and that had £1.8 million in it for rural active travel, which I'm not quite sure if that's trickle down money from the Active Travel England allocation that was announced recently. But the Lib Dem Green coalition teamed up with a Labour who proposed a small amendment to pass that. We've also got funding for a feasibility study for a Tame-Haddenham link and some greenways running into Oxford, so that's all route improvements. Defeated a Conservative amendment which would have taken out all of the discretionary active travel spend, which we certainly didn't support. And then the national travel news, I expect many of you have seen it already, but Ian Walker, Professor Ian Walker, a friend of this online cafe, has teamed up with Marco to Brummelstruit. I don't even know if that's close, but the cycling professor from the Netherlands, to put out another paper on motonormativity and looking at the kind of roots behind that, the causative effects. And one of the interesting findings of that is that people in general support active travel, but think that other people don't support active travel relative to car driving. And I've already swapped a note, and he's keen to come on to here and present that to us and discuss it with us. So we'll try and arrange that for some time in the next, well, it'll be a couple of months given our schedule. I will put a link to the paper in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robin. And Adam.
Yeah, just to kind of highlight that there's a call for evidence on the integrated national transport strategy, which is still, the deadline is the 20th of February, which is in 2 days' time. I know the Low Traffic Future org people, Roger and Geffen et al., they put together a really good sort of reading on that. And then the other thing on a national sort of level as well is, if you haven't seen it yet, and I've put another link to it in the chat, is basically there have been announcement of local transport sort of allocations for active travel. The details of which I haven't been able to find. I don't know what's been allocated to who or what, but there's just a high level sort of information. So if anybody actually has a breakdown of, because these are the active travel tranche 5 allocations, and I didn't even know councils were bidding for those or when they bid for them, or what they bid for. So so it would be interesting to see what those are. So for example, WECA's received 4.7 million, but what that actually breaks down in terms of capability funding, etc., that's not known as yet, or I'm going to have to do an FOI, which is very frustrating.
Thank you, Adam. Matthew?
Hello, Sally. Hello, everyone. Sorry for being a bit late. Mine is probably a call for support or help. The second phase of our LC WHIP scheme is ploughing ahead through Active Travel England auditing in Darlington. And I've heard we're going to get a sparrow, which is all very exciting. However, all the sparrows I've seen have been pictures, and they tend to be bi-directional cycle paths crossing a main road, maybe then joining a bi-directional path that goes off into the distance. But ours seems to be one directional traffic on either side, but there will be continuation. So it's simply a crossing being put onto a road that will have a cycle lane on one side and a cycle lane on the other side. I'm really concerned about conflicts of people want to go straight on while cyclists wait. I haven't managed to see any schematic drawings of sparrows. All I've seen is nice pictures in press releases and on council websites. So if anyone was able to point me to existing sparrow schematics or really good practice where you have cycle movements going straight on and crossing, I'd be really keen to look at those. I'll put my email in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. And if anybody has any ideas, please either put it in the chat or email Matthew. Steve.
Hi there. I attended the West Yorkshire travel meeting. It was in Wakefield Town Hall, but the whole of Tracy Brabin, Mayor Tracy Brabin's team was there. It was a really interesting meeting, showing their plans for West Yorkshire, and they were sort of saying how, to back up what Robin has said, they've done all these surveys, and the least interest was in cycle routes, but the most was in roads. But two of their team cycled every day, and they were flying in the face of, I don't know, convention in a way. They were saying that Leeds city centre, which is transformed. I used to cycle up to Beckett Park from Leeds city centre every day for nearly 17 years. I worked there 28. But they're sort of saying that they're not having any car parking or garages in Leeds city centre anymore for accommodation, and that any new car park will be built outside the cities in West Yorkshire. So they're trying to really reduce the amount of traffic in there. And the other thing was showing all their plans for active travel with little bridges across roads. But they did emphasise that it's just not all about bikes, and that we must consider pedestrians as well. You know, they were sort of saying, you know, just don't think of bikes. You know, we need people on foot as well. But it was really good how everything's been thrown in the mix now. All the buses have got to go through the council now, and they will pick the best franchise. So Aviva buses were there, and they said, oh, well, we'll be gone in 6 months. So there's a lot of change afoot, but I was really heartened to hear that they weren't just taking notice of these surveys, which I said mostly by car drivers. But I thought their plans were really good. And I've been to Leeds city centre recently, and it's fantastic. It's transformed compared to what I used to go on. And again, these bi-directional cycle routes look really good, you know, especially the ones that you can go against the direction of traffic. So, you know, I'm quite heartened by it all. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. Yeah, we had somebody from Leeds, I think, maybe earlier last year talking about plans, and I think, yeah, a bit further down the line we should get somebody back again to talk about sort of what they're kind of how they're
that'd be great.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to move on. H, do you want to put, if you've got another question, do you want to put it in the chat? Just because I can realise we're kind of getting timers
I was
ticking
just going to
on
comment
now.
on Steve, actually. I've just made a remark to the guys in Sheffield that we could run 100% electric express coaches between Sheffield and Leeds and do exactly what we're doing with Ember. You can cycle to where the coach stops at a motorway intersection or something like that, and you get a very, very fast express coach, electric coach, by cycling to it using active travel. And it saves the coaches getting lost around the town. So that's what I was doing.
Very good. Thank you. Great. Well, we're going to move on to our speaker section now tonight. As I said at the outset, I'm really delighted to have Neil Carter here, who's going to talk about the history of cycling. So I'll hand over to you, Neil. Oh, you're muted still.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, there's some interesting discussion there about so it's putting meat on the bones of some things I was looking at during my search for the book. I'll just share my screen with you. Yeah.
Perfect. Great.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, as I was saying, some of the conversation there, I was it brought back some kind of some of the things that I was looking at during my research for the book about and how cycling activism and lobbying became a part of of everyday discourse, really, from the 70s and the 80s, and I'm going to be touching upon that in the paper briefly. Just to say, I mean, Sally mentioned my book, so I might as well just give it a bit of a plug. It's basically Cycling the British. It's a book looking at cycling from the Victorian period up to the 21st century. And it looks at its development from various perspectives: sport, leisure, travel, or tourism, I should say, and as a form of transport. And one of the book's main arguments is that riding a bicycle is a political act, both consciously and unconsciously. And as this book is based largely around my chapter on cycling the environment from about 1970. It's a time when cycling becomes an overtly political act. Anyway, before getting on to the 70s, we just need a bit of historical context about the changing ideas of the bicycle from during the 1960s and how ideas had changed. And why they had changed. So firstly, we need to kind of take into account the changing social economic context of this period. So industrialization was taking place, not as quickly as it would later, but it meant fewer people working in factories, and they were living further away from their workplace. So there was less need for the bicycle to act as a practical form of transport. I mean, you might have seen old photos of men mainly cycling away from the factory gate when work was over. People also had great social aspirations during this period, and this included being part of a car-owning democracy. As we know, there was an exponential rise in the number of cars on the road, vehicles on the road. So in 1950, there were 4.4 million on the road, and 20 years later, it was 15.4 million. So you can see that was an exponential increase. And as a result, governments increasingly catered for motorization. And one example of this was the Buchanan report here on the left, this image taken from the report itself, which is correctly titled Traffic in Towns, which came out in 1963. I mean, it was partly a response to increasing traffic congestion, but it was essentially a report into how cities could be adapted to mass car ownership. But there was no mention of bicycles in the report. The bicycle was increasingly be seen as obsolete as a form of transport. Thus, it was increasingly seen as a machine of leisure and for children, hence the image of the chopper here, which came out in about 1970. in addition, at the same time, there were growing concerns over safety for cycling on the roads, especially children, due to the congestion and this increase in cars on the road. So this was a broader context in which cycling as a form of transport found itself in by 1970. So what changed? Well, there was a growing environmental backlash. So there was a growing environmental backlash by the 1960s, which was due to the growing motoring and pollution and the congestion the car was caused, and also man-made disasters like the Torrey Canyon oil tanker disaster, or just off the Scilly Isles. And there was also an emergence of a new form of politics regarding environmentalism. And this was in evidence across the entire political spectrum. It was taken by people with a wide range of motivations. Now, while it emerged in the 20th century, they also had some roots in going back to the 19th century with the National Trust, and there's another example of it with the Clean Air Act. But by the 1970s, we can see that there was emergence of new political groups such as Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, which had their roots in the 1950s through the New Left and other progressive social movements such as C&D, which was formed in 1957. So environmentalism, it became a forum for mainly left-leaning and liberal groups, and also was a product of the counterculture from the 60s. But as I said, it also attracted mainstream bodies. So the National Trust continued to act as a kind of lobbying group for the environment. Now, the impact of this kind of new movement was seen through the emergence of initiatives and lobbying groups in civil society. So here in 1970, we had the first Earth Day, which was held in the USA. It was a creation of a senator, Gaylord Nelson, and 20 million Americans demonstrated for a cleaner environment. 3 years later, there was a schools eco action group, which was organized by pupils. So this predated Greta Thunberg. A very successful campaign was Clear, campaign for lead-free air, which was led by Des Wilson and led a very successful media campaign. And a 1983 report highlighted the mounting evidence of this the negative impact of lead petrol, despite the lobbying of the oil industry. In 1990, the Environmental Transport Association was founded, and this was a UK broad-based lobby group which campaigned for the most environmentally friendly forms of transport. So as you can see, the nature of the political debate was changing. Okay, so how did the bicycle become a environmental an icon of environmentalism. Well, perhaps surprisingly, it was only initially a small part of the debate and the Friends of the Earth's wider campaign. So, for example, a kind of seminal environmental publication was the Environmental Handbook, which came out in 1971, but it only contained a brief reference to the benefits of cycling over motoring. One factor that helps cycling become more of an environmental icon, as it were, was actually motorisation. Ironically, in some ways, motorisation left a political and cultural vacuum within the cycling world. So previously, the club run, the cycling club run, this had symbolised the traditional cycling culture just through its sheer visibility. Particularly in the 30s and the 50s, you'd see, lots of clubs, club runs, and this had kind of been a political act in itself. But the disappearance of these club runs from the roads reshaped public perceptions of cycling, because it had created a vacuum with this disappearance. So the environment as a factor stepped in, and so cycling was thrust into this debate over the environment, and this then allowed it to emerge as this icon of environmentalism. And especially after the 1973 oil crisis, a growing discourse emerged over the benefits of cycling as an alternative form of transport. So how did this manifest itself within the political sphere? Well, mainly the bicycle cycling more generally emerged, an emergence of grassroots activism, and also there was action at local government level. So in 1978, the London Cycling Campaign was established, and by 1987, you had 4,000 members. And as you can see from this image on the right, it became, over time, integrated into policy-making decisions in London. And this was a characteristic of local politics, with this integration of lobby groups into decisions over transport and cycling. Friends of the Earth in 1981, it staged a Reclaim the Road event in Whitehall with 7,000 cyclists taking part. So by then, Friends of the Earth had seen the benefits of cycling as a kind of campaigning tool in many ways, and they would continue to promote cycling, and it would be the bicycle would front its overall campaign for the environment. At the same time, the more traditional cycling bodies, particularly the CTC, the Cyclist Touring Club, they were also involved in campaigning. I mean, they go back to the 19th century. It was a very traditional body, but by this time, with the decline of cycling, they were much more integrated, as you can see from the image, into cycling policies. In terms of local governments, in the 70s, there was a lot of enthusiasm post the oil crisis, and there was around about 20 local council schemes proposed for urban areas, including cycle paths. They're using the Stevenage scheme as a kind of as an inspiration. So those were schemes in places such as Peterborough, Cambridge, and Middlesbrough. But these measures, initiatives were quite patchy, and they kind of reflected what the activity of local cycling groups more generally. And by the 80s, they were affected by the Thatcher cuts. So while at the time there was lots of enthusiasm, central government wouldn't get on board really until about 1990 with the benefits of cycling. And this kind of highlights more generally the importance of political will being important in pushing forward cycling policy. So you might know the example in Amsterdam, where in 1971 the bicycles were actually banned from the Amsterdam city centre, but it was reversed a few years later, and we can see the benefits or the product of that reversal today, and with Amsterdam being a arguably the premier cycling city in the world. Probably the main most significant example of grassroots activism was and lobby groups with Sustrans, which would develop from being a grassroots body to being an important agency for development of cycling, cycle paths, and also the enhancement of cycling's status. So there's a bit of background about Sustrans, which stands for Sustainable Transport, I'm sure you know. So it was established in 1977 as a Bristol cycle group called Cycle Bag, which I had to look this up. It's called Cycle Bag stands for Cycle Your Calf and Leg Energy Bristol Action Group, and it changed its name to Sustrans in 1983 when it was formed as a charity. So one of perhaps its most famous initiative was the 1979 cycle. It built a cycle path between Bath and Britain on a disused railway line, 8 kilometres. And this would eventually be a kind of catalyst for a nationwide reinvention, you could call it, of disused railway lines becoming cycle paths. So the year after the Bath to Britain cycle path was built, a report came out in which which recommended more cycle paths being converted to from these disused railway lines. As you can see, they've had many developments since then, including the 1989 Transpennine Trail, which is from Hull and York to Liverpool and Southport. And in 1995, the National Cycle Network was established. And by 2012, there were 14,000 miles of new routes for cycling and walking to be created. So this was changing the landscape and opening access. So in many ways, it was, you could argue, quite revolutionary, and highlights the kind of how systems had started from very kind of modest beginnings and has become this important national organisation. Okay, so I was just going to end by looking at asking a few questions about looking at cycling in '99. To what extent had anything changed in light of these developments? So I brought out a few kind of facts from the early 90s, which you can see there, about a number of adults who own a bicycle, and estimated bicycles owned in the UK. I suspect that those numbers have been pretty steady over the last, almost, you could argue, century. Bicycles always been very popular. In terms of who uses the bicycle, it was said in 1991 there were 1.1 million daily commuters, but only 2% of journeys in the UK were then made by bicycle, compared to West Germany, which is 10%, Denmark 18%, and the Netherlands 27%. This is 1992. So in that sense, nothing had much changed in terms of cycling returning as an important, you could argue, form of transport. And again, York and Oxford are two of England's most pro-cycling cities, and while there is 20% of journeys made on bikes, elsewhere in Europe, the figures are 40 to 50% in Munster and Groningen in the Netherlands. And also, perhaps finally, one of the main factors in how, which has affected cycling over the last 50 years, is the accident rate and the perception of accidents in cycling on Britain's roads, and to a certain extent that's borne out by these facts, that it's 5 times higher in the Netherlands and over 10 times higher compared to Denmark. Well, that was because 30 years ago, but it seems that those figures are pretty consistent. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I'll leave it open to questions.
Thank you, Neil. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can see everybody? Now, if people want to ask questions, feel free to put your hand up, or you can put them in the Q&A. I can see there's one question in there already. I'm going to start though. I kind of was interested in what Friends of the Earth kind of really did a lot of campaigning around cycling in the 70s. Did that peter out in the 80s, or did they carry on? And I know that there is still sort of some work around that, but what happened to that campaigning around that?
Yeah, it kind of campaign, it petered out by the 1990s, early 90s, when they went for a more kind of holistic campaign. I'm trying to remember now what the actual campaign was. But yeah, the bicycle itself as this kind of icon, that kind of to a certain extent fell out of favour by the early 90s.
Yeah, thanks. John, you've got a hand up. I know that you put a question in the Q&A. Do you want to ask it?
Thank you. I'll just repeat the question in the Q&A. I think, yeah, thank you, Neil. You've sort of presented it as it was. I just wondered about a bit of evaluation and thinking, as it were, from the other end of the telescope. Was it in fact a disadvantage that cycling became linked with environmentalism? And might it, we can't rewind the clock, but might it have been better had the bicycle simply been promoted as an icon of practical and effective, efficient everyday travel? Did environmentalism bring with it baggage that was unfortunate?
Put me on the spot there. Well, as you say, you can't turn the clock back, and in some ways you could argue that the environment acted as a kind of catalyst for reviving bicycles, and certainly it had a kind of political force behind it then to kind of push forward the cycling as a form of transport, because it was just up until then it was being kind of marginalised as a form of leisure associated with sport, and that was it. So I think perhaps.
I suppose that's my point. It was seen in certain ways, but it was never seen, even in those environmental days, for what it could be for everyday travel. That was my point, really. And did we miss a trick? What was it that we hitched ourselves to the kind of, well, it wasn't the wrong bandwagon, but what was it that it could have been much more effective had it had
well, I think it could have been more effective, yeah. But there was a lot of initiatives. There were a number of initiatives. I mean, if you look at the Stevenage example, that was kind of followed by quite a few places, and I think there was an awareness more generally that something had to be done to a certain extent. But there was the political forces behind acted against cycling, for the road lobby for a start, and then which was in the 80s, there was a Thatcher cut, and basically the Thatcher government was in the lobby, in the pocket of the road lobby. So I mean, there was one quote I came up with, I found. I'm trying to remember the exact number now, but by about 1990, the Department of Transport had about 11,000 people working on the roads, not literally, obviously, but civil servants, and for cycling there was less than 100. So you can see where the priorities were always going to lie with government.
Yeah, I guess it's what chimes as well, I suppose, with the times, isn't it? And it's those arguments that's what we still try, don't we, to have kind of make it relevant, and yeah, and maybe you can't ever, with the benefit of hindsight, yeah, maybe you can't, when you're there at the time, I suppose you're pushing, aren't you, at what you think is maybe going to work. I did see another question in the chat. Matthew Snedker asks, it said that everyone seeks status. Was advertising bike ownership an aspirational status symbol ever going to win as an aspirational status symbol? In a better way of
trying to think. Well, I mean, I think that perhaps comes later. I think it's perhaps a more recent development. I'm kind of guessing the, I mean the one of the changes, in terms of bicycle technology from this period was the emergence of the mountain bike, and the kind of mountain bike emerged out of this period. But again, that wasn't really a road bicycle, more for leisure purposes. Although initially, what has been, obviously people do use it on the road. In terms of status, I think that's perhaps more of a recent development, 21st century one, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess at the time in the 70s, car advertising was really pushing car ownership.
Yeah, well, in bicycle adverts, I mean, the market really was that for children. You know, that's why we had the chopper, and I don't know what anybody else was riding them, but you know, there was the chipper and a tomahawk, which were kind of similar models. So there was the, you know, when there was the switch over to, you know, road bikes becoming much more of a kind of status symbol. I think that's more of a you know, the 21st century development.
And do you know what kind of, why is it though that other countries, like looking at the Netherlands, but also to some extent Germany and Denmark in the 70s, they did pivot, you know, to different degrees and build for bicycles, but we didn't, even though we had all that activism and we had some of these initiatives starting. I mean, is that all just, would you say, having looked at it in the round, is that all just Thatcher and a complete shift?
No, I think political culture is important. So, I mean, you said you had Carlby talking about cycle paths back in the in the 30s. Well, I mean, because there was opposition from the cycling authorities to the cycle paths, and of course the Dutch thought that was madness. They couldn't get their head around it. You know, so there was a kind of political culture within the cycling groups, because they thought the road it was a kind of was part of a kind of British liberal tradition that cyclists should be able to cycle where they like. So that they didn't really in Britain kind of conform to this kind of more corporate approach that the European cycling bodies did. So there was a kind of separation, or you know, between or difference certainly between Europe and Britain. So there was a much closer involvement, for example, in between the Dutch cycling authorities and Dutch state authorities than there was in Britain, and you know that that's partly to do with the lack of, you could argue, cycling infrastructure within the country. So there's it's twofold. So the cyclists themselves are you know, relatively individualistic, or have been, and so there's been a lack of kind of cooperation between cycling bodies and the state.
Thank you. Yeah. I've got another question for David Arditi. Also asks about the cycle lobby. Wasn't the main problem with the cycle lobby historically its failure to engage with the issue of danger, especially for children, whereas Dutch campaigns were very much about stopping danger?
Possibly, I don't know about the Dutch campaigns, but I mean, it seemed that's probably correct. I mean, there was. I mean, depends what you mean by not engaging with safety. I mean, you could argue that Britain, in many ways, was quite successful in engaging with safety. There was a national proficiency scheme. I mean, hands up, everyone who's done the proficiency scheme. I mean, I did, yes. I did in the 70s. I mean, there were tens and thousands of children who actually did that scheme. But at the same time, the landscape of children was changing in the interwar period. So there was, the great fear of children going out playing outside, and the danger of the road was emerging. So no matter what, how much safety approaches.
Right. Thank you very much.
No matter what the kind of safety initiatives, it was, there were other factors working against it.
H, do you want to come and ask something? H, you got a hand up? No, we seem to have lost him. Do we have any more questions for Neil? No, very quiet. Oh, Adam, you put a hand up.
Yeah. How did vehicular cycling and John Forrester kind of, I know you sort of hinted at. I mean, the impact must have been quite profound, because I know it came out of America, but it seems to have adopted sort of that sort of mentality. Yeah, you kind of see it still within some councillors, the idea that you should act as a vehicle and just own the road. Yeah, and how do you think that lent very badly towards this? Because it was almost like a protest movement in terms of not having that space taken, road space taken away.
Sorry, I missed you.
Well, no, I was just wondering, do you see that as, in the history, did you see that affect policy in some ways? Because you had, like you said, you had cycling groups, some opposing creating safer infrastructure for cycling. So I don't know if that had, if in your book you saw sort of that sort of approach come in and be problematic, or do you think it held back where we are now by years, decades?
There's been residual tensions between cycling groups, cyclists, and government groups. There's always this idea as well within government that, and I'm sure you're aware of that, the emphasis is always on the cyclist when it comes to safety. It's not on drivers of vehicles. So the emphasis has always been on cyclists, that they need to be responsible, and so that's led to a kind of negative perception of cycling more generally. With that basically you shouldn't cycle on the roads. Cyclists should be using other kind of facilities. So that I think that has been a problem. But with the kind of growing infrastructure, I mean, perhaps it's less of a problem now.
Yeah, I guess it really has changed over the last decade, hasn't it? Sort of cycling groups and approach to.
So I've cured my IT issue.
Oh, have you? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to react.
We need to close up in really, really soon. So.
Okay, well, two quick ones. In the 1970s, Richard Hutchings, who was the architect of the National Parks Act, was also County Solicitor for Derbyshire, and he actually started reusing old railway lines in 1971 by opening the Tissington Trail and the High Peak Trail. But the other emphasis we've also got is that the road safety infrastructure or approach is entirely the opposite of the approach given to airlines and shipping and rail, where the emphasis is on removing the risk. And where we emphasize wearing PPE, we have actually failed to address the risk. when you eliminate the risk, you don't need PPE. That's the point to make.
Yeah, thank you, H. Jill, I'll take you as well, and that will be the final question, and then Neil, if you want to respond, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, no, it was just really quickly. I wanted to say tonight has been yet another reminder that we actually have something really special in Stevenage, and you know, having lived here all this time and just use it daily, it is really nice to have that reminder. So it's just a shout out, you know, to our speaker as well as anybody else. Anybody who wants to come to Stevenage, we'll always show you around.
I've been there. I went especially there to have a look around. So you know, I've tested out the Stevenage cycle paths.
Excellent.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'll all be off to we'll all be coming to visit you now, Jill. I have to say I've never cycled around Stevenage, and it is on my list of places to come and visit. So a huge thank you to Neil. That was really, really interesting, and lots of really good questions. We are taking a break next week, and I can't actually tell you who we have the week after. We have a mystery guest the week after, but we'll see you back on the, I don't even know what date that will be. Somebody help me out. It'll be the 4th of March. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.